The invitation, a heavy cardstock embossed with the intertwined initials of Liam and Emily, felt like a physical weight in Sarah's hand. Today was her brother's wedding, a milestone that should have been celebrated with uncomplicated joy. Yet, a familiar knot of anxiety tightened in her stomach. Navigating Liam's new life, his polished fiancée, and her equally refined family had been a delicate dance for the past year, punctuated by Emily's subtle yet persistent condescension. This wedding felt like the final act, a stage where Sarah's outsider status would be amplified under the bright lights of societal expectation. Standing before her mirror that morning, Sarah smoothed down the fabric of the dress she'd found on a deep discount, the slightly too snug fit a tangible manifestation of her inner unease. "You look like a movie star," a bright voice chirped from the doorway. It was Noah, her 9-year-old son, his innocent admiration a brief respite from her swirling worries. "Thanks, sweetie," she'd replied, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. The drive to the sprawling venue was filled with Noah's innocent chatter about his Uncle Liam's big day, a stark contrast to the silent film reel of awkward encounters and veiled insults playing in Sarah's mind. She remembered a time when Liam, 5 years her junior, had been her closest confidant, a bond forged in the quiet aftermath of their father's absence. But Emily's arrival had subtly, inexorably, driven a wedge between them, leaving Sarah feeling like an unwanted guest in her own family's narrative. The grandeur of the approaching estate, with its manicured lawns and the promise of opulent celebration, only served to heighten her sense of isolation. The wedding reception unfolded in a predictable rhythm of polite applause and murmured congratulations. Sarah navigated the crowded room, a forced smile plastered on her face as she accepted perfunctory greetings from Liam's expanding social circle. Emily's family, impeccably dressed and radiating an air of effortless superiority, offered a brand of strained civility that felt more like a social obligation than genuine warmth. Sarah tried to fade into the background, to become a mere observer in this meticulously orchestrated celebration of a life that felt increasingly distant from her own. Noah, however, remained a bright spot, his innocent wonder at the towering floral arrangements and the glittering chandeliers a welcome distraction from the knot of anxiety tightening in Sarah's chest. The clinking of glasses signaled the start of the toasts, a tradition Sarah usually enjoyed. But tonight, it felt like a prelude to something ominous. Emily, radiant in her pearl-white gown, took center stage, a microphone in her hand like a conductor's baton. Her initial remarks were a carefully curated blend of gratitude and affection, directed towards Liam and her own family. Then, her gaze drifted towards Sarah, a subtle shift in her demeanor, a barely perceptible tightening of her smile. "And of course," Emily continued, her voice laced with a saccharine sweetness that Sarah had come to recognize as a warning sign, "we have Liam's wonderful sister Sarah here with us today. It takes a special kind of strength to navigate motherhood on your own. We all admire your resilience, Sarah." A ripple of polite, yet undeniably awkward laughter spread through the room. Some guests chuckled uncertainly, unsure of the underlying tone, while others, particularly Emily's clique, offered more unrestrained amusement. Sarah felt a familiar heat rise in her cheeks, her carefully constructed composure beginning to fray at the edges. But the true blow came moments later. Janice, Sarah's own mother, a woman whose approval had always been a fragile, elusive thing, raised her champagne flute, her voice amplified by the microphone as she leaned in conspiratorially. "Yes," Janice drawled, a cruel smile playing on her lips. "She's like a discount model with a scratched label. You take what you can get, I suppose." A wave of laughter, louder and more unrestrained than before, erupted through the room, washing over Sarah like a physical blow. Forks paused halfway to mouths, conversations abruptly ceased, and the sound seemed to wrap around her. A suffocating shroud of public humiliation, Sarah sat frozen, the blood pounding in her ears, her hands trembling so violently she couldn't bring her water glass to her lips without risking a spill. Beside her, Noah's earlier joy had completely vanished. His big brown eyes, wide with confusion, and a dawning understanding of his mother's distress searched her face. "Mommy," he whispered, his small voice trembling slightly. "Why are they laughing at you?" The innocent question pierced through Sarah's carefully constructed defenses, shattering the fragile wall she had built around her pain. The question hung in the air between Sarah and the echoing laughter, a raw, exposed nerve. Before Sarah could even process an answer, before she could formulate a response to the innocent cruelty of her son's question, Noah did something unexpected. With a suddenness that belied his 9 years, he pushed back his chair. There was no childish fidgeting, no hesitant shuffling. It was a decisive movement, a quiet act of rebellion against the palpable discomfort that had settled over the room. All eyes, which had moments before been fixed on Sarah with a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity, now swiveled towards the small figure rising from his seat. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. A wave of panic washed over her, quickly followed by a fragile tendril of hope. What was he doing? Surely he didn't fully grasp the weight of the humiliation she had just endured. Yet, the determined set of his small shoulders and the unwavering glint in his wide brown eyes suggested otherwise. Slowly, deliberately, Noah began to walk. His small frame moved with a quiet purpose across the polished wooden floor of the reception hall, each step seeming to amplify the sudden hush that had fallen. Conversations died down mid-sentence, the clinking of silverware ceased, and the collective gaze of over 100 wedding guests followed his progress towards the raised platform where Emily still stood, a triumphant smirk playing on her lips. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of apprehension. She wanted to call him back, to shield him from whatever awkwardness or even ridicule might follow this unexpected intervention. "Noah," she started to whisper, her voice tight with anxiety. But the word caught, a mere breath in the suddenly silent room. She watched, frozen, as he reached the 2 short steps leading up to the stage. Emily, initially oblivious to the small figure approaching, turned as Noah's hand reached for the microphone stand. A flicker of annoyance crossed her perfectly made-up face, quickly masked by a condescending smile. "Sweetheart, are you lost?" she asked, her voice dripping with a saccharine sweetness that grated on Sarah's raw nerves. But Noah didn't answer. He simply continued to adjust the microphone stand, his small hands working with a surprising steadiness until it was at a more comfortable height for him. A murmur rippled through the room, a collective rustle of confusion and intrigue. Was this part of the entertainment? A cute, unplanned moment with the flower girl or the ring bearer? But Noah was neither. He was Sarah's son, the quiet, observant boy who usually preferred the intricate world of his Lego creations to the chaotic energy of social gatherings. Liam, who had been staring intently at his lap since his bride's cruel remarks, a muscle twitching in his jaw, finally looked up, his gaze meeting Sarah's across the crowded room. There was a silent question in his eyes, a mirror of her own bewilderment. Then, surprisingly, he raised a hand towards the DJ, who looked as if he was about to intervene. "Let him speak," Liam said, his voice low but firm, cutting through the rising whispers of the guests. All eyes now turned to Noah, the small boy standing resolutely at the microphone, his small hands gripping the cold metal stand as if it were the only anchor in a storm. The room fell into an absolute silence, the kind of silence that precedes a momentous announcement or follows a shocking revelation. Even Janice, who had been basking in the perceived victory of Emily's cruelty, slowly lowered her champagne flute, her expression shifting from smug amusement to a wary curiosity. Emily, a forced, brittle smile plastered back onto her face, leaned down towards Noah, her voice still laced with that artificial sweetness. "Is everything all right, honey?" she asked. Her eyes narrowed slightly, a hint of steel beneath the sugary surface. But Noah remained focused, his gaze fixed on the sea of faces before him, a small figure poised to speak words that would shatter the carefully constructed facade of the perfect wedding. A profound silence descended upon the wedding hall, a stark contrast to the earlier boisterous laughter. Every eye was fixed on Noah, the small boy standing resolutely at the microphone. Emily, her forced smile now completely vanished, stared at him with a mixture of disbelief and a dawning apprehension. Liam, his face a mask of confusion and a growing unease, watched his nephew intently. Sarah sat frozen, her heart pounding in her chest, a silent plea escaping her lips. "Please, Noah, be careful." But Noah seemed unfazed by the intense scrutiny. He took a deep breath, his small hands gripping the microphone stand for support, and his gaze swept across the assembled guests. When he finally spoke, his voice, though small, was surprisingly steady, cutting through the silence like a sharp, clear chime. "I heard her say something," Noah began, his gaze fixed directly on Emily, his innocent eyes holding an unwavering conviction. A collective gasp rippled through the room, a wave of shocked whispers passing from guest to guest. Emily's eyes widened, a flicker of panic momentarily replacing her earlier annoyance. She opened her mouth as if to interrupt, but no sound came out. Noah continued, his voice clear and unwavering. "Before the wedding started." The air crackled with a newfound tension. The polite curiosity that had initially greeted Noah's appearance had morphed into something more akin to stunned anticipation. What could this 9-year-old boy possibly reveal that would warrant such a dramatic pause in the wedding festivities? Sarah's mind raced, trying to piece together any overheard conversations or unguarded moments that Noah might have witnessed. He had been with her for most of the day, but she vividly remembered sending him to find the restroom while she helped Liam with his boutonniere earlier that afternoon. 5 minutes. That was all it had taken. Emily's carefully constructed facade began to crack. Her shoulders stiffened, and her perfectly painted lips tightened into a thin, pale line. She shot a nervous glance at Liam, who was now leaning forward, his brow furrowed with concern. Noah continued, his innocent words carrying a weight far beyond his years. "I heard Emily talking to one of her friends." A palpable wave of discomfort washed over Emily's side of the room. Several of her bridesmaids exchanged uneasy glances, their earlier smugness replaced by expressions of apprehension. Noah's unwavering gaze remained fixed on Emily, his simple statement hanging in the air like an unspoken accusation. He paused for a brief moment, as if gathering his thoughts, and then delivered the unexpected blow. "She said she didn't really want to marry Uncle Liam." A collective gasp, louder this time, echoed through the stunned silence, punctuated by the sharp intake of breath from several guests. Liam's face, which had been a study in confusion, now registered a dawning horror. He stared at Emily, his eyes searching for any sign of denial, any indication that this was all some terrible misunderstanding. But Emily remained silent, her gaze locked on Noah, a silent battle of wills being waged between the innocent child and the increasingly flustered bride. The stunned silence that followed Noah's unexpected pronouncements hung heavy in the air. Emily, her face a mask of disbelief and a dawning horror, finally found her voice, a thin, strained sound. "That's not true," she muttered, her eyes darting around the room as if searching for an ally, someone to validate her denial. But the faces of the assembled guests remained fixed on her, a mixture of shock and a growing suspicion clouding their expressions. Liam, who had been staring at Emily with a look of dawning comprehension, finally broke his silence. Is that what you said?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper, laced with a raw vulnerability that Sarah had rarely witnessed. Emily's carefully constructed composure began to crumble. "Liam, come on!" she pleaded, her voice rising in pitch, a desperate edge creeping in. "He's just a child. You can't possibly believe the words of a 9-year-old over your own fiancée." Her attempt to dismiss Noah's accusations as childish fantasy fell flat in the charged atmosphere. Several guests exchanged uneasy glances, their earlier amusement completely evaporated. Just then, a voice, clear and steady, cut through the tense silence from the back of the room. "I heard her too." All heads swiveled towards the speaker. It was Rachel, one of Liam's old friends, a woman who had drifted from their circle after Emily's arrival. She stood tall, her hands clenched at her sides, her gaze fixed directly on Emily. "I went into the bridal suite to bring Emily her shoes earlier that afternoon," Rachel continued, her voice resonating with a quiet conviction. She didn't see me, but she said exactly what Noah just said, word for word. A collective gasp swept through the room. The air crackled with the undeniable weight of Rachel's corroboration. Emily's face, which had been pale with shock, now flushed crimson with a mixture of rage and panic. "Oh my God!" she exclaimed, her voice shrill. "Are you all seriously doing this to me? On my wedding night?" But her outburst only seemed to solidify the growing belief in her duplicity. Liam stood as if struck by lightning, his face etched with devastation. He looked from Rachel to Noah, and then back to Emily, a profound sense of betrayal clouding his eyes. "I asked you so many times, Emily," he whispered, his voice cracking with emotion. "I asked if you loved me, if you were sure, and you kept saying yes." Emily reached out a hand towards him, her expression softening in a desperate attempt at reconciliation. "Liam?" she began, her voice pleading. But Liam recoiled, shaking his head slowly. "I don't know what's true anymore," he said, his voice barely audible. "But I know my nephew didn't just make that up, and I know my sister never deserved the way we treated her." His words, though quiet, resonated through the room like a thunderclap, a stark acknowledgement of the pain Sarah had endured. For the first time all evening, someone truly saw her. Emily didn't scream, didn't shed a single tear. She simply stood for a moment, her face a frozen mask of disbelief and fury, before turning sharply and walking away. The click of her heels on the polished tile echoed in the stunned silence, growing fainter with each determined step until it disappeared completely, leaving a void where her presence had been just moments before. Another silence descended, different this time. It wasn't the shocked stillness that followed Noah's words, but a heavy, awkward quiet filled with unspoken thoughts and shifting alliances. A lone clap broke the tension, hesitant at first, then joined by another and another, until a wave of applause rippled through the room. It wasn't a celebratory roar, but a steady, heartfelt acknowledgement, not for the departed bride, not for the bewildered groom, but for the small boy who had dared to speak the truth. Sarah sat, her hand pressed against her mouth, tears finally welling in her eyes, blurring the faces of the guests who were now beginning to stir, murmuring amongst themselves, unsure of how to proceed with a wedding that had so dramatically derailed. Liam eventually made his way over to Sarah's table. She stood, trying to compose herself, wiping away the tears that seemed determined to keep flowing. She braced for anger, for blame, for the complicated emotions that surely must be swirling within him. But he didn't say a word. He simply pulled her into a hug, a long, tight embrace that felt different from any hug he had given her in years. A hug that acknowledged her pain, her resilience, and the chasm that had grown between them. "I'm sorry," he whispered into her shoulder, his voice thick with emotion. "God, Sarah, I'm so sorry." In that moment, the dam finally broke. Sarah's arms went around him, a reciprocal embrace that released years of unspoken hurt and distance, the years of navigating their separate lives, the awkward family gatherings, Emily's subtle barbs. It all seemed to crack, like fragile glass finally giving way. Sarah didn't know what the future held, if their relationship could ever truly return to what it once was. But in that embrace, she felt a flicker of hope, a sense that he finally saw her, truly saw her, and that was more than she had allowed herself to expect. Across the room, Janice remained seated, her expression unreadable, her champagne flute still clutched tightly in her hand. She offered no apology, no acknowledgement of the chaos her words had unleashed. Her silence spoke volumes, a stark contrast to the tentative reconciliation unfolding between her children. Later that night, the sprawling wedding venue glowed softly in the rearview mirror as Sarah and Noah sat in the near-empty parking lot. The silence in the car was a comfortable one, a stark contrast to the tense atmosphere of the evening. Noah, his small face softened with sleep, his clip-on tie askew, leaned against the window. "You okay, baby?" Sarah asked gently, her gaze meeting his in the mirror. He nodded slowly. "Yeah, are you?" His simple question resonated deeply, hitting her harder than any of the harsh words spoken inside. A small smile touched her lips. "I think I am," she replied, her voice a little shaky but filled with a newfound lightness. "I think I'm really okay." A moment of quiet understanding passed between them. Then, Noah's sleepy voice broke the silence again. "You're not a discount model, Mommy," he mumbled, his eyes half closed. "You're the best mommy in the world." Tears welled in Sarah's eyes once more, but this time they were warm, healing tears, like rain after a long drought. Back home, she tucked him into bed, holding him a little tighter than usual, pressing a kiss to his forehead. "I'm so proud of you, Noah," she whispered. "You were so brave." A sleepy smile flickered across his face. "You taught me," he murmured, and in that simple statement, everything shifted. For so long, Sarah had carried the weight of being a single mother, feeling somehow less than, carrying an invisible label of inadequacy. But in that moment, through her son's unwavering courage, she was reminded of her own strength, her own resilience. She wasn't broken, she was human, and she had survived. In the days that followed, Liam postponed his honeymoon, a silent acknowledgement of the shattered illusion. He and Sarah talked, really talked, for the first time in what felt like years, a fragile bridge of honesty beginning to rebuild between them. Janice sent a cold, brief text, devoid of any real apology, and for the first time, Sarah didn't seek her approval. She had Noah, and more importantly, she had rediscovered a sense of self-worth that no one could take away. People often say weddings bring families together. This one had done the opposite. It had stripped away the masks, revealing the raw truth beneath. And in that unveiling, Sarah hadn't lost anything of real value. She had gained clarity, she had gained truth, and she had gained a profound pride in her son's courageous heart. The person who reminded her of her own integrity wasn't a polished socialite or a well-meaning friend, but a 9-year-old boy in a clip-on tie, holding her hand. If this story resonated with you, if it made you feel something, please like this video. It helps us reach more people. And if you believe in the power of truth and the courage of standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult, share this story. Don't forget to subscribe for more real and honest stories, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next video. Thank you for watching.